About a year ago, inspired by my long-term love of Jane Austen's 1813 novel Pride and Prejudice, I made a series of 5 videos about what the book reveals about family relationships and social rank, developments in transport and also record keeping, parish registers being introduced that were pre-printed, the sort of things that might not strike the casual reader but are things that really stand out when you are a family historian. I used that series to sort of explore how these changes and attitudes and other circumstances might have affected the characters in Pride and Prejudice had they actually been real people really living in the 1810s. Recently, I noticed that 4 of Jane Austen's other novels open with details that might catch the attention of the keen genealogist. Let's take Northanger Abbey. That tells us that Catherine Morland is the 4th of 10 children. She's got 3 older brothers. She's got an immediately younger sister called Sally or Sarah. Her father is a clergyman named Richard, and her mother is still alive when Catherine is 17. There's a family tree in that. Look at Mansfield Park. That tells us about the 3 Ward sisters. The eldest marries Mr. Norris, a clergyman. Maria marries Sir Thomas Bertram, a baronet. And Frances marries Naval Lieutenant Price, and she proceeds to have 10 children, amongst them the heroine, Fanny Price. Persuasion goes one better. The very second paragraph consists of a totally fictitious extract, of course it's fictitious, these are fictitious characters, from The Peerage. Well, there are books about the peerage, Burke's Peerage and so on, that really exist in real life, so it's not too much of a leap here. This one includes precise dates of birth for Sir Walter Elliot, his 3 daughters, his 1 stillborn son. It mentions the maiden name of his wife. It mentions the name of his father-in-law. It tells you something about how Sir Walter sees himself too. He isn't content with what is written in the peerage about himself, and he annotates it as family members get married. His daughter Mary's wedding date is included. He even goes so far as to write down the name of his son-in-law and the name of his son-in-law's father and his residence too. Later we do learn also that Sir Walter's eldest unmarried daughter Elizabeth has effectively been mistress of his house since her mother died 13 years ago. Not unlike Emma Woodhouse, really. So from this we can very quickly work out that the novel is set in the year 1813. But in genealogical terms, I would argue that there is one other opening chapter written by Jane Austen that is frankly remarkable when it comes to family history and relationships. We need to talk about Sense and Sensibility. Sense and Sensibility was published in 1811, but it had been written some years earlier. What is going on at the beginning of the novel? We're very quickly told that the Dashwood family had lived at Norland Park in Sussex for many generations. Nice nebulous many generations, a bit like the Darcys at Pemberley in Pride and Prejudice. The owner of Norland is a Mr. Dashwood. He's a single man who lives to a very advanced age. He survives his unmarried sister by 10 years. And after the sister dies, obviously wants a bit of company, so he invites the family of his nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, who is the legal inheritor of the Norland estate, and Henry's family to live with him at Norland. You can infer from that that old Mr. Dashwood hasn't got any children, he's a single man, of course not. It also implies that old Mr. Dashwood must have had a younger brother who predeceased him. Old Mr. Dashwood has to be the oldest brother, otherwise he wouldn't have inherited the estate. So from that we can already construct a very basic family tree. The other amazing thing about Sense and Sensibility is that when it comes to the characters' ages and dates of key events in their lives, the novel is exceptionally detailed. There are sections, as there are in most of Jane Austen's novels I think, where it is quite hard to say exactly how much time passes between two events, but other developments can almost be mapped out day by day. At certain parts of Sense and Sensibility, you're talking almost hour by hour. Here we are at the beginning of the novel. Old Mr. Dashwood has died. His nephew Henry Dashwood has inherited Norland Park. So far, so good. Henry continues to live there with his wife. We never find out her birth name, so let's just call her Mrs. Dashwood because that's what she's called in the novel. They've also got 3 daughters. Eleanor is 19, Marianne is about 16, Margaret is about 13. And presumably they live at Norland happily enough for about a year after Uncle Dashwood passes away. And unfortunately, at this stage, Henry Dashwood dies. And this is where the trouble starts. Because Henry Dashwood was married twice. And from his first marriage, he had one son, John, who, based on the information available in the novel, I guess was somewhere between 26 and 28 years old. Based on that reckoning, if his father had married when he was about 21, Henry Dashwood, who has just died, may have only been as young as 50. That's quite possible. And the novel does imply that Henry's uncle had made a will in which he explicitly stated that Norland was to pass down the male line. It goes from Henry to his son John, it then goes to John's son Harry, who is about 4 years old when the book starts. We can sort of guess that Harry has been named after his granddad Henry. So clearly it is important to Uncle Dashwood that Norland stays in the Dashwood family. There are living male heirs who are ready to inherit it when their time comes, which is really convenient, and the novel does make it fairly easy for us to work out the identities of the owners through the successive generations, and we're going forward into the future here long after the novel finishes. So we can make a family tree based on the line of succession at Norland Park. So is John Dashwood, Henry's son and heir, ready and prepared to take on the responsibility of running Norland Park, having just inherited it from his father? That would be one way of putting it, yes. John and Fanny, his wife, don't actually own a house until Henry dies and John inherits Norland. The novel tells us that John was very young when he married, and I agree with that. It is said that the wedding takes place very soon after John comes of age, after his 21st birthday, probably before he was 23 really. If John and Fanny have a 4-year-old son, Harry, we can reasonably suppose that they have been married 5 to 6 years at the most. Fanny has a £10,000 dowry when she marries, and until they move to Norland, they actually are living in Harley Street in London. What sort of neighbourhood are they coming from? What's Harley Street like? Today, you think of Harley Street, you think of private doctors, clinics, the medical profession generally. But what was going on 230 years ago? I've actually found a reference to a real life resident, approximately corresponding with the time when the novel is set. This is a marriage announcement at Marylebone. We'd call that Marylebone today. Michael Newton Esquire of Upper Harley Street and Thorpe in the county of Lincoln, to Miss Bagshaw of Duchess Street, Portland Place, daughter of the late Colonel Bagshaw. So Michael Newton, the bridegroom, is an esquire, which means he's a gentleman. He hasn't got a title, he's not a sir, he's not a lord, he's not a baronet, he's not a viscount, but nor does he have a profession. So he must have an independent income. He would seem to be landed gentry. Besides his Upper Harley Street residence, the newspaper has told us that he has got property in Thorpe in Lincolnshire. Which is interesting because it's going to draw some parallels there in another video with Fanny Dashwood's mother, Mrs. Ferrers. I'm going to look at that further on in the series. But John and Fanny uproot themselves from Harley Street, they move to Norland in Sussex. Now legally, they are probably quite within their rights to move to Norland as soon as they do. But honestly, they are not especially kind to the grieving Mrs. Dashwood, who has just lost her husband of 20 years. She has been married to him for far longer than John's mother ever was. And what is even worse, I would say, knowing the 1995 film adaptation as well as I do, as much as I love that film, I think they do play down John's essential selfishness. They make Fanny the more selfish, mercenary one, but I think they're peas in a pod, as we say in the north, because even much later in the novel, John meets his half-sister Eleanor in London. They just happen to be there at the same time, and he decides he's going to give her an update on how dreadfully expensive he's finding it to enclose Norland Common. So he's complaining already, he's moved into the house that he legally inherits, and he's already whinging about how much it's costing him. What did he expect was going to happen? And yet in the same conversation, he then goes on to also tell Eleanor that he's just purchased a property called East Kingham Farm. Really not so short of money as he pretends to be, is he? You must remember the place, he says to Eleanor, where old Gibson used to live. So that suggests that the farm is somewhere in the vicinity of Norland Park, probably something that old Mr. Dashwood had owned. I'm not saying for 1 minute that John has evicted a farmer on his own land there, because for someone who is a gentleman, who claims to be in constant need of cash, it would be extremely short-sighted to leave a property, especially a farm, vacant if you won't personally be living there and you don't have the skills or the knowledge to work that land, when you could simply let it to a tenant farmer and at least get some regular rent money and the knowledge that that land is going to be worked efficiently, the produce is going to market and sold, and you will get the income from that. Based on that, I am not convinced at all by John's claims of poverty. But what's this enclosure business he's talking about? That is something that is really relevant to the mid-18th century onwards. So let's look at enclosure. This is taking me back a little bit to GCSE social and economic history. We did Britain from 1750 to 1900, I think, and I did the social and economic option. So we did cover enclosure. Put simply, enclosure is to do with land management. Traditionally, towns and villages were split up into strips of land, and these strips would be shared out amongst individual farmers and husbandmen and agricultural workers. So everybody in the village or the town had a piece of land that they could work, that they could grow things on, they could be self-sufficient with. They might have enough surplus produce to send to market. It's a way of everybody using the land in the most productive way possible at that time. There were a few problems with this system. If these strips of land are scattered all across the village, you don't necessarily get allocated 2 strips of land next to each other. It might be that one is at one end of the village the other is half a mile down the road. So it's not really a very productive, economical or efficient use of your time to have to be walking, taking your animals from strip to strip. There are disadvantages to the traditional strip farming system. There came a point in the 1700s where somebody realised it was far easier just to divide up all the land into fields and then you allocate however many fields to each farmer. By the 1750s, enclosure was usually achieved by an Act of Parliament. If you search around on the websites of county archives, you may find maps and other original documents that were drawn up for various villages and towns as part of the Enclosure Act because they needed to know what land was where and how it was going to be divided up. Similar to a tithe map, but not exactly the same, made for different purposes. Don't confuse the two. As a landowner, John probably owned much of the land around Norland Park. Maybe even technically he owned the common land. He may well, as the landowner, have sought a special Act of Parliament to authorise the enclosure of Norland Common. The reason it's called a common is because traditionally it was common land. It was free space where anybody could graze their animals. Presumably this even includes people that are travelling through the area. So you graze your horse there overnight or while you're staying in the local inn. By enclosing Norland Common, what John is effectively doing is taking that option away from travellers and anybody else who perhaps cannot afford to rent a piece of land. He will, however, very kindly, once he's got his map drawn up, rent each field or section of land back to whoever can afford to pay the rent for it. Which is nice of him. And it does mean that he's going to get a bit of money, probably. But what happens to the people who can't? There are going to be people who are just scraping by around Norland. What are they going to do? As this is Sussex we're talking about. Maybe they will move away. Maybe they will find work in newly industrialised towns. Sussex at this time has got developing seaside resorts. Worthing and Brighton, where the Prince Regent had built the Royal Pavilion in 1787. These are becoming fashionable seaside resorts as we understand them today. So where fashionable seaside resorts are coming up are going people with money to spend on holidays and seaside cures and all the associated things, the taking the water, the bathing machines, all the things that you might associate with a Regency seaside resort. Could there be an opportunity for jobs for some of John Dashwood's tenants if they have to move? Maybe those with savings have got just enough to rent a boarding house. They let the rooms out to tourists the same way that a bed and breakfast is run today. Whether John Dashwood has actually considered this is another matter entirely. Has he realised that these tenants who maybe might have to move away from the Norland area might be forced to leave a place where their family has lived for centuries? They might have generations buried in the parish churchyard. On the other hand, as long as he gets his rent money from the remaining tenants, is he actually the sort of person that would care? I do wonder. As you can probably tell by now, I am not a massive fan, on balance, of John and Fanny Dashwood. Rereading the novel to pull out the information I've used in this has actually made me more aware than ever that they're really not very nice people, and I don't think I would like them if I met them. Which is just as well that they're fictional. Let's move on to the children from his second marriage. Because when Henry Dashwood dies, His widow is still alive, Mrs. Dashwood, described as being hardly 40. In chapter 8, she actually makes fun of her middle daughter Marianne, who is complaining that Colonel Brandon, her new friend, must be absolutely ancient at 35, can't possibly feel anything as strong as love or passion. Mrs. Dashwood promptly responds with, "At this rate you must be in continual terror of my decay, and it must seem a miracle to you that my life has been extended to the advanced age of 40. So she's just poking fun at her middle daughter there, which I think is a really funny way of putting it. Based on this, you can sort of work out that Mrs. Dashwood must be less than 15 years older than her stepson, John Dashwood. John's wife, Fanny, certainly thinks it feasible that Mrs. Dashwood will live another 15 years or more. The novel indicates that Mrs. Dashwood herself brought no significant fortune on marriage, so she didn't have a huge, massive dowry. And when her husband dies, although she doesn't continue to live at Norland Park, she is left all the china, the plate and the linen that they brought from their previous house at Stanhill, because they only moved into Norland when the unmarried auntie died and the uncle who Henry Dashwood was heir to invites his heir and young family to live with him. But it is very, very typical that a man would leave the household essentials to his widow, or if his wife had died before him, another female relation. I've even found evidence of this in my own research. In October 1796, which is pretty much perfect timing when we're talking about Sense and Sensibility, my many times great uncle, James Lee, a gentleman, so he's a similar status socially to Henry Dashwood, made a will in which he says that he leaves his wife the household goods and the furniture in the house that he now lives in. He also leaves her the silver, the plate and the china, except for his largest silver tankard. He singles that one out. This is in lieu of £100 worth of goods and furniture which were promised on marriage. I think they must have had some sort of marriage settlement drawn up, if you read between the lines there. He also leaves to his wife all the linen, sheets, spirituous and other liquors in the house. So she's getting the alcohol with the bottles and the barrels containing them, which is very helpful, James, thank you. How on earth are you supposed to carry spirituous liquors if you haven't got bottles to put them in? You just can't, can you? However, he mentions also some plate, and so does Mr. Dashwood. Don't confuse plate with dinner plates. Dinner plates would be classed as china. Plate is just metalware. And going by James Lee's definition of it in his will, I think he's talking about trays and serving dishes that are not silver, because he does make a distinction between the plate and the silver. Mrs. Dashwood is at least all set up to move into her new home at Barton Cottage in Devonshire, and when she leaves Norland to go to Barton, she sends the household linen, plate, china and books, the heavy goods really, with a handsome pianoforte, by water, according to chapter 5, which is a really sensible way of doing it. That was the most effective way to get heavy goods long distances. You'd send them by water. And if these items had been sent from Brighton, for instance, and sailed round the Isle of Wight towards the southwest, it would be easy enough to get them inland at Exmouth, onto the River Exe, up the river into Exeter, and from there you would transport them by road to Barton Cottage, which I'm going to explore a bit further in my next video. To finish this video off, I thought it was worth drawing up a more comprehensive family tree to show who is who in the Dashwood family. Considering that it is now 211 years since Sense and Sensibility was published, I hope you don't think it's technically a spoiler if I tell you who gets married to who at the end. I think most people are probably aware of how Sense and Sensibility ends by now. I hope you enjoyed the video, I hope it was interesting, and I will be back very soon with the section on Barton Cottage.